Thank you so much on behalf of our group for the opportunity to present our work today. So I think a lot of what I'll speak to are themes that have already been brought up by other speakers, and so it's just really interesting to see how a lot of the same themes and challenges echo in different diseases and different projects, which I know is the purpose of the panel today. So hopefully we'll echo some of those themes. And so I'm going to talk today about our project on behalf of MGNet, which is the Rare Disease Network for Myasthenia Gravis, and a project that we started at the beginning of COVID, which is adapting disease-specific outcome measures for telehealth. Next slide, please. So just a bit of background, and so this so myasthenia, just even more background, is a neuromuscular disorder caused by a deficit of neuromuscular transmission, and it presents with weakness, which can affect various muscles, notably muscles that control eye movements, muscles of swallowing, breathing, neck, arm, and leg. It affects patients of all ages. There is a hereditary form and then also an autoimmune form. And this project focuses on the autoimmune form. And there are about 60,000, it's a rare disease, not an ultra rare disease. And there are about 60,000 patients in the US right now currently affected by myasthenia. And so there was, before we go on to the next slide, if you can just go back for a sec. So there was recently the first rare disease network founded and funded for myasthenia gravis called MGNet. And I'll speak more about it, but this is a multi-center rare disease network. And as part of this, there is a natural history study, which is a natural history and biomarker study called Explore-MG2. When in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we were thinking as a group of how to add telehealth to this to be able to continue the natural history study, and then to, in the future, facilitate MG clinical research and enhance clinical trial readiness. Next slide. And so further, what is the rationale? Well, in myasthenia, the pandemic really has disrupted both clinical research and patient care. There was a huge transition to teleneurology at multiple centers, which over a very short period of time, and expertise in virtual neuromuscular care and virtual research assessments was just immediately recognized as an unmet need. There's been a history of virtual care in other areas of neurology, which have been easier to assess virtually. However, neuromuscular has, besides ALS, has not been an area where there's been significant virtual care. Next slide. And so in March, when COVID began, we had this idea for the study concept of ADAPT-teleMG, and relatively rapidly have been able to move forward with it. So over the summer, we finalized the protocol and the design, and then over the fall have moved into study initiation, and now we are at the point of study startup in the new year. Next slide. And just to highlight, MGNet is a consortium of several institutions, and there's a statistical core, which is at University of Alabama, the administrative core, and the coordinating center, which is at GW. The DCRI, which is at Duke, which provides a central IRB and project management, and then the Data Management Center, which is at the University of Cincinnati, and then all the clinical sites you can see listed. So any project that we were going to initiate required a lot of coordination between these various sites and components of the rare disease network. Next slide. And just to highlight, we're geographically, focused more in the Midwest and on the East Coast, but there's a wide representation among that. Next slide. And so the key attributes of the study was that it was a project within the existing multi-center research group already. And so there was a lot of the infrastructure already in place, which I think was helped facilitate the rapid start. There's a centralized IRB, which also is helpful in that regard. It uses NIH common data elements. There's the coordinating center, as we mentioned, the statistical core, standardized SOPs. And then there is a REDCap database, which was already built, which we have just added to for the study, which was already hosted by the DMCC. Next slide. And so the overall objective of the study is a pilot study to evaluate telehealth visits and assessments for patients with myasthenia. The specific primary objective of the study is to assess the inter-rater and intra-rater reliability of modified versions of existing validated MG-specific outcome measures, which have been adapted for the clinical telemedicine and virtual research environment. And the ultimate goal is to further validate these telehealth adapted MG-specific outcome measures for routine clinical care and clinical trial settings to continue clinical care and research during the pandemic and then meet needs in the future. Next slide. So just to go into how we've structured this, the primary outcome is the inter-rater reliability of an adapted version of an existing scale called the Myasthenia Gravis composite score. We will be looking at a comparison between assessments performed at the 2 visits by independent raters. The second primary outcome is the intra-rater reliability of the same score. Next slide. And we have multiple secondary objectives related to other well-defined myasthenia gravis outcome scales that have been previously validated. Next slide. We also have exploratory objectives looking at the feasibility and acceptability of these assessments. There's a telehealth usability questionnaire, which we'll be supplying to patients and the providers. We'll look at participant satisfaction and then look at the ability of the new outcomes in correlation with patient-reported outcome measures, which are previously validated. Next slide. And so we aim to enroll 50 participants from across the sites who are established patients in MGNet clinics. It is a relatively, it's a very short study. So there are 2 to 3 study visits. The reason why it's 2 to 3 is that the first visit is a tech optimization visit. And if the patient can do that in the same visit as the baseline visit, then they don't need a separate visit. The visits are within 3 to 10 days. And the idea is that we are enrolling stable patients over a short time interval to assess the reproducibility of these scales. The participants are going to perform the patient-reported objective MG scales adapted to the virtual environment. Patient-reported and objective scales. And then the scales will be performed and scored in real time over the video by the site investigator, and then transferred in a video file and observed asynchronously by 2 independent raters who will have similar clinical information as the investigator and rate the videos. If there is disagreement, then a third adjudicator will participate. The telehealth usability questionnaire will measure the acceptability for participants and investigators. Next slide. So we are just at the process of beginning to do study startup. So we anticipate that we will be able to enroll And the success will be enrollment and data collection. We know there will be challenges along the way. The challenges that we've already faced are what others have described in terms of privacy considerations, particularly with transferred video, with identifying information, how that will be stored in a multi-center study. And then just in terms of with multiple sites and coordination of the data has been a challenge to start up. And those have been the primary challenges to date. Next slide. So we hope that this approach will be a model of the performance of clinical trial study visits via telemedicine and virtual participation in natural history studies in myasthenia and other rare diseases. We think that the study design will be particularly applicable to disorders which depend on collection of disease-specific scales and a physical exam. We think that the virtual consent and the multi-center enrollment will be a precedent in myasthenia. And then the asynchronous analysis of the physical exam data has applicability for central raters in interventional clinical trials. Next slide. So additional discussion points, I think we'll get to, we're at time, so we'll get to in the larger discussion. But others think similar issues to what others have brought up about policy changes, what the borders are in terms of clinical care versus research, and how to standardize that. Next slide. So this study meets a contemporary unmet research need, and the structure is to evaluate telemedicine specifically and how it can be applied to future questions and studies in myasthenia and applied to other rare disease networks. Thank you.